The morning sky above the Netherlands was unnaturally quiet. At 6:22 on the 23rd of September, 1944, the air was cold, clear, and empty, exactly the kind of sky every fighter pilot both loved and feared. No clouds meant perfect visibility, but it also meant nowhere to hide. Then came the sound, not the familiar engine note of a German fighter climbing into the morning light, not the sharp mechanical roar of the engine that powered the feared Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. This sound was deeper, heavier, multiplying. The kind of sound that made experienced pilots freeze for a fraction of a second because they knew exactly what it meant. High above him, descending out of the rising sun, a formation of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters was already positioning itself for the attack. 48 aircraft, perfectly spaced, perfectly coordinated. Inside the cockpit sat a veteran pilot of the Luftwaffe, a man who had survived 3 years of World War II air combat. He had 16 confirmed victories. He had fought Soviet fighters. He had intercepted Allied bombers dozens of times. And yet, in that moment, he faced something entirely new. Because this was no longer a duel between pilots. What he was about to encounter was something far more dangerous. A system of radar, a system of coordinated fighters, a system that had already calculated the outcome of the battle before he even saw the enemy. For the next 6 minutes over the skies of the Netherlands, one experienced fighter pilot would discover a brutal truth about modern war. Courage could still matter, but systems decided the result. 3 years earlier, when he first joined the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, the war in the skies over Europe looked very different. In 1941, German fighters dominated the air war. Allied bomber formations were still vulnerable, their escort fighters limited by range and coordination. A skilled pilot flying a fast aircraft could dictate the terms of battle. Courage, training, and tactical awareness were often enough to decide whether a man lived or died. By 1944, that belief was beginning to collapse. The pilot climbing through the morning sky that September day was Carl Steiger, a veteran fighter pilot who had already survived dozens of combat missions. His career had begun on the Eastern Front in 1941 when he scored his first aerial victory against a Soviet fighter during a routine patrol. Over the following 3 years of World War II, he developed the instincts that separated experienced fighter pilots from the thousands who never survived their first year. He had learned how to read the geometry of the sky, how to turn altitude into speed, how to convert a brief moment of surprise into a lethal firing pass. His aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, was one of the most recognizable fighters of the war. The Gustav variant carried a powerful 30mm cannon mounted through the propeller hub, supported by 2 heavy machine guns above the engine. In experienced hands, it could destroy a bomber with only a few well-placed rounds. The aircraft was fast, aggressive in the climb, and deadly during short, high-speed attacks. But it had one critical limitation: fuel. The Bf 109 carried only enough internal fuel for a few minutes of sustained combat power. German fighter pilots were trained to strike quickly, disengage immediately, and return to base before their tanks ran dry. It was a doctrine built around short defensive interceptions. On the morning of September 23rd, 1944, Steiger's squadron took off from a Dutch airfield near the town of Heteren in the eastern Netherlands. 8 fighters climbed into the early morning sky. 5 of the pilots were veterans like Steiger. The other 3 were replacements with barely enough experience to survive a complex interception mission. Their orders were simple and urgent. American heavy bombers were approaching critical oil facilities deeper in German-controlled territory. Intelligence reports estimated nearly 200 bombers escorted by fighters. The squadron's task was to intercept the bomber formation before it reached its target. The target aircraft were the heavily armed Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft designed to defend themselves with overlapping machine gun fire. Attacking such formations was always dangerous, but experienced German pilots had developed tactics to exploit small weaknesses in the defensive formations. The plan that morning was familiar: climb above the bomber stream, dive through the formation at high speed, fire for only a few seconds, then break away before the escort fighters could respond. It was a tactic Steiger had executed many times before. But this mission was taking place during one of the largest Allied operations of the war, the airborne invasion known as Operation Market Garden. Allied forces were pouring aircraft, fuel, and coordination into the skies above the Netherlands. And while Steiger believed he was climbing to intercept an enemy formation, American radar stations had already been tracking his squadron from the moment their aircraft lifted off the runway. Long before the German fighters reached the bombers, the battle had already begun quietly, invisibly, inside a network of radar screens and radio transmissions that Steiger could neither see nor understand. At 06, 22 inches the morning sky over the eastern Netherlands, the formation finally appeared. From Steiger's cockpit, the bomber stretched across the horizon like a moving wall of metal. Dozens of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft flew in tight combat formation, each bomber positioned to protect the others with overlapping machine gun fire. Their defensive pattern created a lethal crossfire that had already destroyed hundreds of attacking fighters during World War II. A direct approach would have been suicide. But experienced pilots of the Luftwaffe had developed tactics to exploit the formation's few weaknesses. Steiger intended to strike from above and ahead of the bomber stream, diving directly toward the lead aircraft at high speed. In that narrow angle, the bomber's defensive guns had only a few seconds to respond. 4 seconds of firing. 5, at most. Then escape. Steiger pushed his fighter into position. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 rolled smoothly onto its back before dropping into a steep dive. The nose of the aircraft pointed directly at the bomber formation below. Speed built rapidly. 350 kilometers per hour. Subaiwusher. Subaiwusher. The bombers filled his gun sight. At that moment, something appeared above him. Dark shapes dropping out of the morning sun. Dozens of them. The sky suddenly filled with the unmistakable silhouettes of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters diving from high altitude. There were far more than the usual escort. 48 aircraft. They descended in perfect formation, spreading outward as they dropped, like a net closing around the German fighters. Steiger reacted instantly. He abandoned the attack and pulled the control stick hard to the left, forcing his aircraft into a high G defensive turn. The G-forces crushed him into the seat as the wings of the Bf-109 groaned under the stress. The first American fighter followed him, but what happened next was something Steiger had never experienced before. Instead of a chaotic dogfight between individual aircraft, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters attacked in waves. One pair of fighters forced him to turn, while another group appeared at the exact point he tried to escape. Every maneuver he attempted seemed to lead directly into the guns of another aircraft. When he dove for speed, another Thunderbolt appeared above him. When he turned to the left, a second fighter closed in from his flank. Behind him, the voice of his wingman, Hoffman, suddenly broke over the radio. The calm tone from earlier was gone. He was under attack. 3 Thunderbolts were behind him, moving in coordination. No matter how violently he maneuvered, they stayed in position. Then the transmission ended abruptly. Silence filled the radio channel. For the first time in years of combat flying, Steiger began to understand something unsettling. This was not a traditional dogfight where individual skill determined survival. It felt as if the American fighters were operating as parts of a single machine. Every escape path closed before he could reach it. Every maneuver anticipated before he completed it. Somewhere far from the battle, unseen by the pilots in the sky, radar operators and ground controllers were directing the engagement with quiet precision, turning dozens of aircraft into a coordinated hunting system. And inside that system, Steiger had only minutes of fuel remaining. 3 minutes into the engagement, instinct took over. Steiger forced his aircraft downward in a steep dive, pushing the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 beyond the limits most pilots dared to attempt. Speed climbed rapidly, 600 kilometers per hour, then higher. The control stick grew heavy in his hands as the aircraft approached the edge of structural tolerance. Altitude dropped quickly. 2,000 meters. 1,500. At just above 1,000 meters, he pulled the aircraft violently into a tight climbing turn, using every advantage of the Bf-109's superior maneuverability. The heavier Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters struggled to match the sudden change in direction. Several of them overshot the turn, their wider arcs briefly breaking the formation. For a few precious seconds, the sky behind him cleared. Steiger leveled his aircraft and accelerated eastward across the countryside of the Netherlands, the frozen fields flashing past below at more than 500 kilometers per hour. He glanced back over his shoulder. The Thunderbolts appeared smaller now, further away. For the first time since the attack had begun, the crushing tension inside the cockpit eased slightly. His breathing slowed. His grip on the controls relaxed. He believed he had escaped. The price, however, was severe. His squadron was scattered across kilometers of sky. The bomber interception had failed completely. His wingman Hoffman had vanished somewhere in the chaos of the battle. But he was alive. And with careful throttle management, the fuel remaining in his tanks might still be enough to reach a nearby emergency landing strip. The radio crackled. Ground control from the German airfield answered his earlier transmission and directed him toward a temporary landing field near Arnhem. The distance was roughly 40 kilometers. According to the fuel gauge, he had barely enough fuel to reach it. 6 minutes of flight time remained. As he adjusted his course, a disturbing realization slowly formed in his mind. During the entire battle, the American fighters had rarely fired at him. They had not been trying to destroy his aircraft. They had been guiding him. Each time he tried to return toward the bomber formation, fighters appeared to block his path. When he attempted to escape toward friendly territory, another group forced him to turn away. They were pushing him slowly but deliberately away from the battlefield and away from every German-controlled airfield within reach. Then his radio picked up a new transmission. It was not German. The calm voice of an American controller was directing the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt pilots still searching the skies. The message was precise, clinical. A single hostile aircraft had broken away. Its altitude, speed, and heading were reported with unsettling accuracy. Even its remaining fuel endurance was estimated. Within minutes, 2 Thunderbolts appeared directly ahead of him, blocking the approach to the emergency airfield. They were not maneuvering for a dogfight. They were simply standing in his way. Steiger had no choice but to turn again, abandoning the only safe landing site within range. Moments later, the engine of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gesäß began to sputter. The smooth roar of the Daimler-Benz engine faltered once, then again. He glanced down at the fuel gauge. Empty. The system that had been hunting him across the sky had calculated the final moment of the battle with perfect accuracy. Below him, a narrow, snow-covered field appeared through the haze, his last possible landing site. He lowered the landing gear manually and prepared for an emergency landing. The aircraft struck the frozen ground hard. The landing gear collapsed instantly, and the fighter slid violently across the field before crashing into a shallow ditch. The cockpit filled with snow and debris. For a few seconds, there was only silence. When Steiger finally pulled himself from the wreckage, blood running down his face, the remains of his fighter lay broken behind him. The battle in the sky was over. But the war had already found him on the ground. 2 hours after the crash landing, the former Luftwaffe fighter pilot sat inside a temporary Allied interrogation facility somewhere in the forests of the Netherlands. Across the table sat an intelligence officer of the United States Army Air Forces. The officer spoke fluent German and explained the engagement with calm, almost academic precision. From the moment Steiger's aircraft had lifted off the runway that morning, Allied radar stations had detected the formation. Ground control centers tracked the German fighters continuously as they climbed toward the bomber stream. Every change in altitude, every adjustment in direction appeared as moving blips on radar screens. Long before Steiger ever saw the American aircraft, the intercept had already been planned. Ground controllers had vectored dozens of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters toward the German formation. Instead of leaving each pilot to search independently, the Americans coordinated their aircraft through radio commands transmitted from radar stations on the ground. The result was something the earlier years of World War II had never seen before: a networked air battle. Each fighter pilot was no longer acting alone. Every aircraft became a component in a larger system directed by radar operators, radio intercept specialists, and command centers miles away from the battlefield. The technological advantages went even further. The American fighters carried external fuel tanks that dramatically extended their operational range. A fully loaded Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could remain in combat for nearly 40 minutes and still return safely to Allied airfields in Belgium. By comparison, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was built for short defensive interceptions. Its limited fuel supply allowed only a few minutes of full combat power before pilots were forced to disengage. This difference in range transformed the entire strategic equation of the air war. Allied fighters could escort bombers deep into occupied Europe. They could pursue German aircraft far beyond the defensive perimeter of German airfields. Even retreating toward friendly territory no longer guaranteed safety. For German pilots like Steiger, this meant that traditional tactics, skillful maneuvering, aggressive attacks, and individual flying ability were no longer enough to ensure survival. The war in the air had evolved into something larger. Industrial production, radar technology, fuel development, and command coordination had merged into a single integrated system of air power. And once that system reached maturity, individual acts of bravery could no longer change the outcome of the battle. In the years after World War II, many German officers tried to explain why the air war over Europe had been lost. Some blamed the shortage of aircraft. Others pointed to the growing lack of aviation fuel as Allied bombing crippled Germany's industry. Still, others argued that the Allies simply possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. Those factors were real, but for pilots like Carl Steiger, the lesson felt deeper than numbers alone. For 3 years, he had believed the traditional rule of fighter combat. A skilled pilot could defeat multiple opponents through superior tactics, courage, and training. That belief had shaped the culture of the Luftwaffe since the early days of the war. Yet the battle he experienced over the Netherlands in September 1944 revealed something different. The engagement had not been decided by the individual performance of the pilots involved. It had been decided by an entire structure of technology working together, radar networks tracking aircraft from the moment they took off, ground controllers directing fighters toward precise interception points, and long-range aircraft like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt operating with fuel reserves far beyond those available to the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. This integration of technology and logistics created a form of air power that no single pilot could defeat. By 1944, the Allied war machine had become something larger than the sum of its aircraft. Industrial production, fuel engineering, radar guidance, and coordinated command structures had combined into a unified combat system. In that system, individual heroism still existed. Pilots on both sides continued to display extraordinary courage in the skies over Europe, but courage alone could no longer decide the outcome. The mathematics of the war had already been determined in factories, laboratories, and command centers thousands of kilometers away from the battlefield. For Steiger, the 6 minutes he spent fighting for survival that morning were not just a desperate struggle in the air. They were a brief glimpse into the future of warfare, one where networks, technology, and coordination would shape every battle that followed. And it leaves us with a question that historians still debate today. When technology becomes powerful enough to control the battlefield itself, what role remains for the individual warrior? If this story revealed something new about the air war of World War II, share your thoughts below. Which lesser-known air battles from the war would you like to explore next? And if you appreciate stories that uncover the deeper lessons of history, consider subscribing so we can continue examining the moments where technology, strategy, and human courage collided in the skies above Europe.